What if I told you that Native Americans could start a fire with their bare hands during freezing rain or a snowstorm? While European explorers wrapped in wool struggled to strike a damp flint, Lakota warriors or Cree hunters were already warming themselves by a roaring fire. They had no matches or lighters, but they had something much more important, a deep understanding of nature. Their secret lay not in a single method, but in a whole system honed over millennia. They knew which wood burns when wet, which mushrooms smolder for hours, and how to catch a single spark in a blizzard. It was survival elevated to an art form, where a mistake meant not just a cold night, but certain death. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn which natural material growing on trees burns as brightly as paper, even when completely wet. What if I told you that for indigenous peoples, fire was not just a chemical reaction, but a living being that demanded respect? This is where the main secret of their craft lies. Their attitude toward fire was not utilitarian, but reverent, which completely changed their approach to obtaining and maintaining it. In many traditions, from the Great Plains to the forests of the Northeast, fire was considered a sacred gift. It was a gift from the Creator that brought warmth, light, and protection to the world. Losing fire through carelessness was not just a mistake, it was a sign of disrespect for this gift. The flame was the center of social and spiritual life. In a Lakota teepee or an Iroquois longhouse, the hearth was the heart of the dwelling. Stories were told, councils were held, and food was shared around it, and this shared fire brought people together. This worldview fostered an incredible sense of responsibility. The person entrusted with lighting or maintaining the fire had a sacred duty. He had to know all the intricacies of the process so as never to let his tribe down. This philosophy turned a practical skill into a spiritual discipline. When you believe that you are dealing with a living spirit, you will prepare to meet it with the utmost care. You will not allow your tinder to get damp or your firewood to run out. It is difficult for modern people, accustomed to lighters and gas stoves, to imagine this. We demand fire, but they served it. It was this reverent service that gave them power over the flame in the harshest conditions. They did not fight the elements as we do. They became part of them, understanding their laws. They knew that the wind could not only extinguish the flame, but also fan it if directed correctly. This connection was so deep that the process of lighting a fire was often accompanied by songs or prayers. It was a dialogue with nature, not just the simple friction of two sticks. And this dialogue was almost always successful. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such a spiritual attitude towards fire compared to our modern, purely practical approach? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories about forgotten technologies. I am going to reveal the most closely guarded secret of the fire-starting master. This secret is not the method itself, but what is ready to accept the first, barely alive spark. We are talking about a bundle of tinder, a material on which 90% of success depended. Tinder is any fibrous, dry, and highly flammable material capable of catching a spark or smoldering ember. Without it, even the hottest ember produced by friction will simply cool down and die. Indigenous peoples were true experts in finding and preparing this material. In the forest regions where the Iroquois lived, the best tinder was considered to be the inner, velvety part of the bark of certain trees. Juniper and thuja, or white cedar, were especially prized. This bark was stripped from the trunks and kneaded in the hands for a long time until it turned into a soft, cotton-like mass. In swamps and near rivers, cattail fluff was an invaluable source. In the fall, its seed heads burst open, releasing millions of silky fibers. This fluff ignited instantly, like gunpowder, and was ideal for catching sparks from a flint. The inhabitants of the Great Plains used the fluff of certain steppe plants, such as milkweed and cotton. They also collected very dry, finely chopped grass. It was important to find grass that had dried at the root and had not been lying on damp ground. The secret lay not only in gathering, but also in storage. All this precious material had to be kept perfectly dry, even if the owner himself was soaked to the skin. For this purpose, special pouches and pouches were sewn from tanned leather. These pouches were often made waterproof by impregnating them with fat or resin. They were worn under clothing, close to the body, so that their own heat would evaporate any accidental moisture. Losing or getting your Tinder pouch wet was tantamount to disaster. The bundle, or nest, was formed immediately before ignition. The best, finest tinder was placed in the center of this nest of dry grass or bark. It was into this heart that the smoldering ember had to fall. This was the first and most important stage. If the tinder was poorly prepared, all further efforts were in vain. This was the foundation on which the future fire was built. But what if I told you that even the best plant tinder is useless if it gets even slightly damp? In the next chapter, we will talk about a material that is not afraid of moisture and can smolder for hours. You have probably walked past this secret thousands of times in the forest and never suspected its hidden power. What if I told you that the key to fire in wet weather was not plants, but mushrooms? We are talking about wood decay fungi, which were an invaluable resource for indigenous peoples. The most famous of these was the true tinder fungus, or Fomes fomentarius. This mushroom, which looks like a gray hoof growing on the trunks of birch or beech trees, was a natural fire starter. But its power was not in the mushroom itself, but in its processed core. The inner, cork-like part of this mushroom has a unique texture. It was cut out, then boiled for a long time, dried and kneaded. The result was a material known in Europe as amadou, a soft, velvety substance similar to suede. The unique property of amadou was its ability to catch a spark. Unlike vegetable tinder, which required a smoldering ember, this material could be ignited by a single cold spark struck from pyrite with flint. Another champion was chaga, or Inonotus obliquus, a black growth most commonly found on birch trees. Chaga was not as good at catching sparks. Its genius lay elsewhere, in its ability to sustain smoldering. If amadou was the match, then chaga was the wick. A smoldering piece of chaga could smoke for hours, with almost no smell or smoke. This made it the perfect material for transporting fire. A hunter from the Kori tribe, going into the forest for several days, did not take a drill with him. He took a smoldering piece of chaga with him, which was kept in a special container. When he arrived at his destination, he simply blew a flame from it. These mushrooms were incredibly valuable. Knowing how to find, collect, and process them was an important part of survival. They were often harvested for future use, dried and stored above the smoke of the hearth. Such mushroom tinder was much more resistant to moisture than plant tinder. Even if it got slightly damp, it could be quickly dried with body heat. It was a reliable insurance policy in case of prolonged rains. In a world where fire was synonymous with life, these humble wood mushrooms were one of the greatest treasures. They held within them the smoldering soul of fire, ready to awaken at any moment. If you think such ingenuity deserves respect, please like this video. What if I told you that Native American bows and arrows were not only used for hunting? Few people realize that the same principle of tension and rotation that helps launch an arrow at a target once helped humans light their first fire. For ancient peoples, the ability to make fire was no less important than the ability to shoot accurately. Without fire, it was impossible to cook food, keep warm at night, or scare away predators. Therefore, anything that helped speed up this process was valued more than any weapon. One of the most effective and common ways to make fire used the same principles: friction and rotation. We are talking about the bow drill method, which was the pinnacle of ancient engineering and human ingenuity. This method required a set of 4 components, each of which had a special significance. First, there was the drill itself, a thin, straight stick, dried in the sun to perfection. It was made of hard wood so that it could withstand friction and not break during rotation. Secondly, a hearthboard was needed, a flat board made of a softer type of wood in which a small recess had been cut out in advance. The drill was placed in this spot, and this is where the future ember appeared. The success of the entire process depended on the choice of wood. Wood that was too soft burned out quickly, and wood that was too hard did not heat up. The third element was a bow, not the kind used for shooting, but a simplified version. It was a flexible branch, slightly curved and not tightly stretched, so that the bowstring could move freely. It was made from durable wood, such as willow or juniper. The bowstring was wrapped once around the drill so that when it moved, it rotated it back and forth. This principle allowed a person to rotate the drill at a much higher speed than if they did it with their hands. The force of the bow converted the energy of movement into heat and sparks, and therein lay the genius of the method. The fourth component was a pressure block, a stone or piece of solid wood with a recess into which the top of the drill bit was inserted. This block was needed to press down on the drill bit from above and hold it in place. Without it, the drill bit would simply pop out of the hearth. The block also reduced the strain on the hands, as friction and rotation required a lot of force. It was made smooth so as not to damage the palm, and sometimes lubricated with grease to reduce friction. It was a simple but well thought out detail, without which the whole mechanism would not have worked. The principle of operation was ingenious in its simplicity. When a person moved the bow back and forth, the drill began to rotate rapidly, like the axis of a small mechanism. With each movement, the friction increased, and the lower end of the drill dug into the soft wood of the hearth. The friction caused the temperature to rise, and the first smoke appeared at the bottom of the hole. This process was much more efficient than rotating the stick with your palms, because the speed was higher and the hands got less tired. A person could maintain the rotation longer and get heat faster. The pressure block, which the person held in one hand, created the necessary pressure to prevent the drill from slipping. This required coordination and a sense of rhythm, because it was necessary to move the bow, hold the block, and watch the hearth at the same time. The friction of the drill against the fireboard was so strong that the wood began to darken and char. Fine wood powder fell into the slot next to the recess, becoming hotter with each movement. At this point, it was important not to lose pace, otherwise the heat would be lost. An experienced craftsman could tell by the smell and sound that the fire was about to start. After a few moments of intense work, the black powder began to smoke. This was the turning point when the efforts were about to bear fruit. The man stopped moving and carefully lifted the drill so as not to disperse the accumulated heat. Then he blew very gently on the smoldering mass, directing the airflow so that the ember would wake up. Everything depended on the precision of his breath. Too strong an exhalation would extinguish the flame, and too weak a one would not allow it to ignite. The craftsman could literally feel when to stop and when to blow again. If everything was done correctly, a tiny red ember would appear in this pile of wood flour. It was very small, about the size of a pea, but it already contained the energy of the future fire. People treated it with respect, as if it were a living being. This ember was carefully transferred to a pre-prepared tinder nest consisting of dry grass, bark, or down. There it began to smolder more brightly, and after a few seconds a real flame flared up. For the person who had obtained it with their own hands, it was a moment of victory, a small miracle that could be repeated over and over again. Plains dwellers, such as the Lakota, often used a simpler but more demanding method, a hand drill. They did without a bow, rotating a thin stick between their palms. This required incredible endurance, as the hands quickly became tired and covered with calluses. But those who mastered this art could obtain fire anywhere, without any extra equipment. They chose the right rhythm and pressure to maintain the rotation until smoke appeared. This method was older than the bow drill and was considered a test of strength and patience. The choice of wood was crucial. Not all trees were suitable for this work, and only experienced hunters knew the right combinations. For example, a drill made of willow or yucca was often combined with a board made of poplar or cedar. These pairs created optimal friction, which generated heat without destroying the wood. If the wrong material was used, the drill simply slipped without heating up. Therefore, knowledge of wood species was part of the cultural heritage passed down through training and practice. This method, especially with a bow, was considered the pinnacle of skill. It was incredibly reliable in the hands of an experienced person and could save a life in a difficult situation. All you needed to have with you was a knife to make a set of handy branches and boards. Wind, rain, or cold could not interfere with those who possessed this skill. For many tribes, it was not just a skill, but part of their spiritual tradition associated with fire as a symbol of life. How long do you think it would take you to master this method? Some studied for weeks before producing their first ember, while others succeeded on the second day. But in any case, it required patience, attention, and faith in one's own hands. After all, every spark born from wood and air was a reminder of man's ancient connection with nature. In the next chapter, you will learn how they literally carve fire out of stones, turning cold rock into a source of light and heat. Obtaining fire by friction required time, dry materials, and skill. To get even a single spark, it was necessary to rub wooden sticks together long and persistently, maintaining constant pressure and speed, and sometimes changing materials if the wood was too wet or soft. It was a process that required patience and a certain amount of skill, because the slightest mistake would ruin all your efforts. In addition, weather and humidity could completely ruin the result, because the tinder would not ignite. But there was another way, faster, though requiring different resources and knowledge. This method changed the idea of how fire could be obtained in natural conditions without modern tools at hand. We are talking about the method of striking sparks, which was known long before the advent of European steel. This method was a real discovery for ancient man because it allowed him to obtain fire even in cold or wet weather when friction did not help. It did not depend on the dryness of the air or on available materials, but was based on impact and sparks. For thousands of years, people observed how tiny sparks flew when one stone struck another, and over time they learned to use this phenomenon. Gradually, a random observation gave rise to an art that required precision and the right choice of materials. This method became an essential part of the survival culture of many peoples. Many people mistakenly believe that flint and steel are needed to strike a spark. This opinion is associated with later times, when Europeans already brought iron tools and weapons with them. But steel was an imported commodity that only appeared after contact with Europeans and was expensive. Long before that, indigenous peoples used what the earth itself gave them, stones that could be found everywhere. They knew which stone was harder, which gave the best spark, and learned to select the perfect combinations. For them, it was not just a craft, but part of the knowledge passed down from generation to generation. The main pair was flint and pyrite, or fool's gold. Flint was characterized by high hardness and sharp edges, while pyrite, containing iron, was capable of producing sparks. Sometimes other minerals were used, but it was pyrite that combined the necessary strength and composition. Its golden luster was often misleading, but in reality it was not a precious stone, but an indispensable aid in obtaining fire. These stones were easy to find in mountainous areas and on riverbanks, where the rocks came to the surface. Thanks to them, man was able to subdue the element of fire for the first time, not by accident, but at will. When flint struck pyrite sharply and smoothly, the hard edge chipped tiny particles off the mineral. These microscopic pieces of iron instantly oxidized in the air, heating up to a bright glow. Even a single successful strike could produce a whole scattering of tiny stars that flashed for a moment and then disappeared. If there was suitable tinder nearby, one of these sparks could catch on it and start a smoldering fire. But without skill and practice, this was almost impossible to achieve. Every hunter or warrior knew how to hold the stones correctly and in which direction to strike so as not to waste energy. These sparks were not as hot as those from steel, and they did not fly as far. Therefore, it was more difficult to catch them, especially if the wind blew them away. They could not ignite ordinary plant tinder, such as dry grass or moss, because they cooled quickly. It was necessary to look for more sensitive material that could ignite from a weak spark. Since ancient times, people have been searching for such substances and experimenting with different options. It was this quest that led them to amazing discoveries related to mushrooms and wood. This is where the tinder fungi we mentioned earlier came into play. These unusual organisms, which grow on trees, had a dense but spongy structure. If treated correctly, they could retain their smoldering for a long time. Processed amadou or dry dust from the core of chaga was ideal for catching this cold spark. All it took was a light spark for a tiny smoldering ember to appear on the surface of the mushroom. Then the person would carefully blow on it, increasing the heat until a real fire appeared. This process seemed almost magical, but in reality it was the result of a precise knowledge of nature. Charred tinder was also used. This could be a piece of cloth, spongy wood, or lichen, which was first placed in a closed container and heated. Without access to air, the material did not burn, but turned into a brittle, carbonaceous residue. Such tinder would ignite even from the weakest spark, which is why it was prepared in advance. People carried it with them in small bags, protecting it from moisture. It was a kind of battery supply of fire, ready to flare up at any moment. With the arrival of Europeans and the beginning of trade, life changed. New materials and tools quickly spread among the local peoples. The indigenous people immediately realized how much easier it had become to make fire with the advent of steel tools. Now there was no need to look for pyrite or worry about the right shape of the stone. The flint and steel became not just a convenience, but a symbol of a new era. They were used in everyday life, hunting and camping. The combination of flint and steel was much more effective than flint and pyrite. When struck, the steel produced brighter and hotter sparks that could ignite even coarse materials. In addition, such tools lasted longer because steel did not crumble like pyrite. This made it possible to produce fire at any moment, regardless of the conditions. People quickly appreciated the convenience, and the old methods gradually faded into the background. However, the memory of them remained, because without this knowledge, it would be impossible to understand how humanity learned to control fire. The steel striker produced a profusion of very hot sparks. When a person struck it against flint, the air filled with tiny fiery droplets that easily ignited tinder. Even in windy or damp conditions, this device worked reliably. Thanks to it, fires could be lit more quickly, and travel and hunting became safer. The shower of sparks from the flint became a familiar sight at any campfire, a symbol of warmth and life. These sparks could ignite not only mushroom tinder, but also plant fluff, dry bark, and thin birch bark. Obtaining fire ceased to be a painful process and took only a few seconds. Now even a child could learn to light a fire by watching their elders. This was a real step forward for all peoples living in harsh natural conditions, and although the ancient methods did not disappear, the new method became the everyday norm. A set consisting of a flint, a piece of flint, and a bag of tinder became standard equipment for warriors and hunters in the 18th and 19th centuries. Without it, they did not go on a hike or a long journey. Such sets were passed down from generation to generation, decorated and kept as an important part of personal belongings. It replaced older methods, such as the drill, because of its simplicity and speed. However, in difficult situations, when all else was lost, the old knowledge came to the rescue again. People still remembered how to get fire from wood if nothing else was left. It was this memory that connected generations, reminding them that fire was not just warmth, but a symbol of survival. What if I told you that indigenous peoples had their own gasoline for kindling? Even if you have a smoldering ember and a nest of tinder, turning it into a flame in wet weather is a difficult task. This is where natural combustion accelerants, known and valued across the continent, came to the rescue. The undisputed king among such materials was birch bark. Hunters of the subarctic forests, such as the Cree and Athabascans, literally worship this tree. Birch bark contains natural oils very similar to tar. These oils make the bark waterproof and incredibly combustible. Thin strips of birch bark ignite instantly, even if they have just been removed from a wet tree. They burn brightly, hotly, and with characteristic black smoke, producing a strong flame. Even if a hunter fell into an icy river, he knew he could find a birch tree. All he had to do was cut off a few pieces of bark with a knife, and he had ready-made kindling. No other natural material offered such a guarantee. The second most important accelerant was pine resin, or smoly. This is wood saturated with resin, which can be found in the stumps of old pine trees or at the base of dead but still standing trees. This resinous wood was, in essence, a solid fuel. It could be chopped into small chips that ignited from the slightest flame and burned for a very long time. A piece of such smoly could burn like a candle, even in the rain. Resin was also used in its pure form. Lumps of hardened resin collected from spruce or pine trees were added to the fire to increase the heat. Sometimes they were mixed with tinder to make it easier to ignite. In the Great Plains, where there were few trees, there was a different accelerant. It was dried bison dung. These patties were an ideal slow-burning fuel, but their dust was also excellent for fanning smoldering coals. Knowledge of these materials was as important as the ability to produce a spark. A firemaster always carried a supply of birch bark or a piece of resinous wood. This was his guarantee that the fire would be lit in any weather. Which of these accelerants do you think would be most useful in your region? But what good is an accelerant when wind and rain are battering you from all sides? In the next chapter, we'll learn how to prepare a place for a fire right in the middle of a storm. Successfully lighting a fire in bad weather did not begin with friction, sparks, or even tinder. It began with construction. Experienced hunters and travelers knew that flames do not forgive mistakes. Even the hottest coal and the best tinder are powerless if you try to start a fire on wet ground, in an open area, or in the rain. The first step was always choosing a location. This was not a matter of chance, it was a science. A skilled person never lit a fire where it was simply convenient. They looked for a place where the fire could live. Natural shelters were a priority. Rock overhangs, dense fir trees with branches reaching down to the ground, steep slopes protected from the wind, or at least the leeward side of a large fallen tree. Even a small ledge or ditch could save them from gusts of wind that instantly scattered sparks and blew out the heat. The main enemy was the wind. It stole not only heat, but also time. A spark lit in the wrong place would go out before it could produce a flame. Therefore, experienced people did not start with a fire, but with wind protection. This could be a wall of stones, a row of fir branches stuck in the snow, a birch bark shield and on the road, even an upside-down backpack or sled. The main thing was to create a zone of calm where the smoke went straight up and not in your face. The next enemy was moisture from below. Wet ground, melting snow, evaporating moisture. All of this sucked heat like a sponge. Building a fire directly on the snow meant dooming it to failure. As soon as the flames ignited, the snow beneath it melted, turning into an icy puddle. Therefore, before lighting the tinder, people built a platform. In the taiga forests, it was made of wet logs. 2 or 3 thick logs were laid on the ground or on the snow. This was the foundation. Dry branches, birch bark, and wood chips were laid across them, and a fire was lit on this base. The wet logs underneath did not burn, but they prevented the flames from falling through. In mountainous areas where there were more stones, a platform was made of flat slabs. It served as insulation and a heat reflector. A fire on stones gave a more stable flame, and the heat was reflected back up. In deep snow conditions, such as those experienced by the peoples of the subarctic, everything became more complicated. Sometimes it was necessary to dig a hole down to the ground, but more often they built a whole multi-level platform. First they trampled down the snow, then laid a layer of thick logs, then branches, and only then did they light a fire on top. This took time and effort, but it was the only way to keep the heat in. Without this structure, the fire would simply disappear, leaving behind a hole filled with water and steam. Only after the hearth was protected from the wind and isolated from moisture did the actual lighting begin. On average, preparation took 2 to 3 times longer than obtaining the spark itself. But this was what determined whether the flame would survive. Everything was done in a strict order. First, a place was chosen, then a windbreak was built, then a platform, then fuel was prepared. Only after that was a flint or drill used. A mistake in even one stage meant a loss of precious time and energy. Inside the dwelling, fire obeyed the same laws, but the space itself helped it. In a teepee, the hearth was always located in the center, directly under the smoke hole. This was not a random decision. The entire structure of the teepee was built around the fire. The posts created natural draft, and the flames burned evenly without smoking. 2 special poles with valves at the top allowed the airflow to be regulated. They could be opened to meet the wind or closed if the blizzard changed direction. This system provided natural ventilation. Smoke rose upward, and fresh air was drawn in from below through gaps in the floor. As a result, the fire did not smoke, and the temperature inside remained stable. Even during strong winds or snowfall, the flames in the teepee burned as if under a glass dome. In the longhouses of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois peoples, there were several hearths, usually 3 or 4 along the central passageway. Each was served by its own family, but the heat from all of them together created a common climate. The smoke rose and escaped through special openings in the roof, lined with bark. These openings could be adjusted manually, allowing for an optimal balance between draft and heat. Fire here was not just a source of light and heat, it was the architectural centerpiece, the location of the sleeping areas, the smoke vents, even the curve of the roof. Everything was subject to its logic. People literally lived around the flame, like planets around the sun. The ability to build a fire in bad weather was not just a skill, but an indicator of maturity. A young hunter who could light a fire in the rain was considered a person capable of keeping the world warm. It was both a metaphor and a physical truth. After all this complex engineering, from windbreaks to smoke valves, had one goal: to create a small world for the flame where it could live. Making fire is not a single event, but a process consisting of 3 distinct stages. Indigenous peoples understood this and never rushed from one stage to the next. These stages were ember, tinder, and kindling. As we already know, most ancient methods, the drill or pyrite, did not produce a flame, but a tiny smoldering ember. This was the first, most fragile stage. This ember had to be immediately transferred to a nest of tinder. This is where the second stage began. The nest with the coal inside was carefully folded, but not too tightly. The person lifted it to face level and began to blow slowly but evenly on it. This was the moment of truth. The air passing through the tinder fed the ember with oxygen. The ember began to grow, consuming the tinder, and the smoke became thicker. At some point, when the temperature reached the ignition point, the tinder burst into a bright flame. Now the person had not a coal in their hands, but a burning torch. But even this flame was still too weak to ignite the log. The third and most important stage began: kindling. Kindling is small, dry twigs that serve as a bridge between the tinder and the main firewood. Indigenous peoples were masters at preparing kindling. They never picked branches from wet ground. They looked for what is known as widow's brushwood, small dry twigs that had died but were still hanging on the lower parts of trees. They remained dry even in heavy rain, protected by the canopy. They were also masters of feather sticks. With a knife, they removed long, thin shavings from a dry stick without separating them from the base. As a result, the stick became similar to a brush or feather. These shavings were as thin as paper and ignited instantly. The burning tinder was immediately placed under a pre-built shelter made of the finest kindling. As soon as it caught fire, thicker branches, about the size of a pencil, were added. And only when they were burning steadily were branches as thick as a finger added. This process could not be rushed. Attempting to light a thick log with tinder was doomed to failure. Only a patient, step-by-step transition from charcoal to tinder, from tinder to kindling, and from kindling to firewood guaranteed success. Nowhere on the continent was fire as absolutely essential as in the vast forests of the subarctic. Here among the Cree, Athabascans, and other northern peoples, winter lasted 6 months, snow fell 2 meters thick, and the frost was so severe that metal cracked on contact. In these conditions, the inability to build a fire was not just an inconvenience. It meant death within hours. Everything in their lives, tools, habits, even hunting routes, was subordinated to one goal: to stay warm. And at the center of this system was the flame. The North taught discernment. Not just any tree was suitable for fuel, especially in a frozen forest where everything was covered with snow and ice. The Cry hunters knew that standing deadwood burned best. Trees that had long since died but had not yet fallen. Lying on the ground meant being buried under thick snow and ice. Therefore, it took a long time to find such trees. They listened to the sound of the axe. A ringing echo indicated a dry core. Spruce branches, the lower dry, brittle ones, played a special role. They were saturated with resin and ignited instantly, even at -30 degrees. These branches were called the living fire of the forest. Pine and spruce were the main sources of heat, but when they were not available, birch and larch were used. Birch bark, thin and oily, burned even when wet, and was therefore considered a gift from the spirits of fire. It was carefully removed without killing the tree and dried in deerskin bags. Building a fire in deep snow is almost like geometry. If you simply light a flame on the surface, it will melt a hole for itself and extinguish in its own water. Therefore, the first step was to create a platform. First, hunters trampled the snow with their feet or snowshoes, then laid thick, damp logs on top of it, the foundation on which the fire was built. A layer of dry branches, wood chips, and birch bark was placed on these logs, and only then, tinder and kindling. While the first branches were burning, They heated the wood from below, creating a charcoal base on which the fire could burn for hours. Such a fire did not collapse or drown and provided stable heat even in a blizzard. Often, a reflector was built around the fire, a wall of snow blocks or stacks of logs. It directed the heat back towards the people or shelter. Sometimes, if the hunters spent the night in a snow pit or under a canopy, the reflector was made of birch bark or spruce branches arranged in a semicircle. In these lands, tinder was sacred. Without it, there was no fire. The best tinder was considered to be tinder fungus, especially birch fungus, light, porous, and heat-absorbing. It was prepared in advance, dried, beaten with a stone to make it soft, and soaked in fat or birch tar. Such tinder ignited from the weakest spark and smoldered for a long time. Every hunter had his own fire-starting kit, and this set was as personal as a knife or a bow. It consisted of a bow drill, a wooden shaft with a rope bowstring, a stand with a notch, a stone or bone tip, and a bag of tinder. Starting a fire with a drill was not a matter of strength, but of rhythm. It required patience. The movement had to be smooth even, without jerks. After a minute, smoke appeared, and after 2 minutes, a tiny ember, which was carefully transferred to a nest of moss, birch bark, and dry grass. A bow drill was considered more reliable than a hand drill, especially in the cold, when fingers lost sensitivity. Some craftsmen kept the drill, greased with fat, inside their clothing, close to their bodies, so that the wood would not freeze and crack. The shelter and fire were designed as a single system. Sometimes the fire was lit directly in a snow cave or semi-dugout. To do this, a small ventilation hole was made in the ceiling so that smoke could escape and cold air could not enter. If the shelter was small, stones were used. They were heated on the fire, then brought inside and laid along the walls. They gave off heat all night, replacing the living flame. Some hunters created special types of fires. Long ones, elongated lines of fire along which one could sleep, or reflected ones, where the heat was reflected from the wall back onto the person. All this was the result of centuries of observation of the behavior of heat, wind, and snow. But even beyond physics, fire had another dimension, a spiritual one. The Cree and Athabascans had an expression, "He who controls fire controls time." It meant that the ability to light and maintain a flame was the ability to control life itself. Fire witnessed everything. It warmed, dried clothes, melted glue, cooked food, and scared away animals. It was a companion in solitude in the center of the community. Every father showed his son not only how to make a flame, but also how to treat it with respect. Not to throw wood into it abruptly, not to spit into the fire, not to turn your back on it. Fire was a living being that could help if treated correctly. In conditions where the temperature dropped below 40 degrees Celsius, this respect was not an abstraction. It was dictated by practice. A person who forgot about the fire would freeze. Therefore, in northern camps, the flame was never left unattended. Even while sleeping, someone was always on duty, listening to the crackling, adding branches, checking to see if the heat had weakened. It was in this tireless preservation of heat, in the knowledge of every sound and smell of fire, that the true art of survival lay. Where civilization is accustomed to matches and gas stoves, they taught that fire does not need to be obtained, it needs to be known. Why light a fire when you can simply carry it with you? For the peoples of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and other nomadic tribes, this question was not rhetorical, but vitally important. In their world, where settlements changed location several times a month, and sometimes even several times a week, the ability to preserve a flame meant more than the ability to make one. Starting a fire from scratch is no easy task. Even for an experienced person, it took time and effort. Dry tinder, the right wind, dry wood, and concentration. But on the windy prairie, where the wood was often damp and hands were numb, every spark could turn into failure. Therefore, the Lakota and their neighbors developed a system that allowed them to carry living fire, literally to carry it through space and time. The central figure in this system was the firekeeper, a special person, most often an elderly woman who enjoyed trust and respect. Her duty was sacred, to ensure that the fire did not go out while the tribe moved across the plains. This fire was not just a utilitarian flame for cooking, it was a continuation of the hearth around which the life of the clan was built. It could not be rekindled every day because it symbolized the continuity of existence. The same fire that warmed today also warmed yesterday and a year ago. It connected the living with their ancestors. Special containers were used to transport the fire. These could be clean bison horns, smooth and durable, or large shells that retained heat. Sometimes a dried piece of wood was used, hollowed out from the inside and covered with a leather lid. It all depended on the available materials and climate. Inside the container, they placed material that could smolder for a long time. Tinder fungus or chaga. These fungi, which grow on birch trees and old trees, were a true miracle of nature. Dense and fibrous, they could keep embers smoldering for up to a day. A piece of mushroom was lit, allowed to burn, then carefully extinguished, leaving only heat. It was placed in a container along with dry moss or sawdust, sometimes wrapped in birch bark. During the journey, the keeper of the fire carried this vessel on his person, suspended from his belt, in a bag made of raw hide or in a saddlebag. Inside, the quiet breath of fire was preserved at all times. Light smoke, faint smoldering, which had to be maintained. Several times a day, the keeper checked the condition of the ember. If it was dying out, a new piece of tinder or dry wood dust was added, and the ember was gently blown on to bring it back to life. When the tribe stopped for the night, there was no need to search long for dry branches or rub a flint. The keeper simply opened the container, took out a small ember, and placed it in a nest of birch bark, moss, and dry grass. A minute later, there was a flash, a crackle, and a new flame was already burning in the center of the camp, continuing the old one. This method was not only practical but also deeply spiritual. In every fire lit from this ember, people saw a living thread connecting them to the past. It was the same fire that once warmed their ancestors when they first came out onto the plains. It never died. It simply passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. In rituals, fire was often perceived as a living entity. It was fed, cared for, and spoken to. It was believed that fire could hear and understand. It could not be thrown away or trampled on, only put to sleep by carefully covering it with ashes so that it could rest. Therefore, the keeper of the fire was not just a person with a bag of coals. He was a spiritual guardian, a mediator between people and the spirit of the flame. We can see that the ability of Native Americans to light a fire in any conditions was not magic. It was the result of thousands of years of experience, a deep understanding of ecology, and a respectful attitude towards nature. Every element, from the tinder fungus to the method of building a platform, was part of a complex and reliable system. They knew that dry tinder should be kept close to the body, that birch bark burns wet, and that pyrite produces sparks. They understood that fire must be isolated from snow and protected from the wind. This knowledge was not just a set of life hacks, it was the foundation of their civilization. This approach, based on observation, patience, and preparation, allowed them to survive where modern humans would not last a day. Fire was their faithful ally because they knew how to take care of it. What other aspects of indigenous people's lives or skills would you like us to cover? Perhaps you are interested in their methods of hunting, building dwellings, or navigation. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the wisdom of our ancestors.